Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the last Career Talk webinar of the year. It's finally December. My name is Lorena Real. I am the president of FAU's Postdoc Association. And because it is the last, we're wrapping up the year, this is the last one this year, I would just like to take a few seconds or a minute just for some acknowledgements. I would really like to thank the people that have been involved in both the creation and the development of these series. I know I always mention here that this is a co-creation of the Postdoc Association and the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs at FAU, but I would just like to really quickly just thank the people that are involved by name. Of course, Karen Scarpinato and Gina Niemi at the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs for all the support. Gina specifically have put so much work and effort into this since the first time we brought this idea up to her. So she has really helped us a lot and to get this up and running. Cami Clark has helped a lot with the marketing and advertising for this, so developing the flyers and spreading the message so that everyone could know that this is happening and be able to join us. Jennifer Governor, you don't see her, but she's always here with us in the background. She administrates all of these Zoom sessions, so all of the technical part to make sure that everything is running smoothly. So she helps with that. Thanks a lot. And obviously, thank you all for joining us, all of the postdocs, grad students, technicians, and now recently even some people from our neighbor institutions. So FIU, Scripps, Max Planck, all of you are welcome. We tried to this year really bring a diverse group of speakers to highlight different career paths for PhDs. And we hope you have enjoyed the talks that you've attended. And we are obviously always open to feedback. So if you have any suggestions, any comments, any criticism to us, please let us know. Now, just real quick before we get started, I have just one more quick message, and that's specifically for FAU's postdocs. We will be forming a new board next year, for 2020. So if you have any interest in joining us and even replacing some of us, please let me know. We will be calling for volunteers. You're gonna hear about this a bit more, both in the newsletter, and I'll send out another email. But if you are interested, or if you're not sure what we do and have questions, please feel free to email me and ask anything that you would like. I'm gonna leave my email on the chat here. So if you have any interest or questions, please let me know. So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kristin Lewis. Dr. Lewis earned her PhD from the University of Michigan, and she is currently a project director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also known as AAAS. But before taking this position, she has also navigated and gained some experience both in the industry and the government. So she has a very interesting career path. Thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us. We are very excited and looking forward to your talk. There you go.
Okay. My apologies for that, everybody. So as Lorena mentioned, I'm Kristin Lewis. I'm a physicist by training. I got my PhD in physics from the University of Michigan in 2011. And since then, I've had a meandering path through industry, government, and nonprofits. But all of that has had this thread of science communication throughout. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my path, as well as a few science communication tidbits. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we can. All right. So first of all, I started in grad school. I had a good time. I played with lasers and spinach proteins in the lab all day. But I didn't quite know what I wanted to do next. Um, I was quite happy that I was able to develop some hobbies outside of the lab during during graduate school. I found knitting in particular helps keep me sane from those long days that I'm sure you all are familiar with. So it's very important to help find something outside of whatever it is you're doing to provide that balance. For me, that was knitting. You can see some of my half-finished socks here. But overall, grad school was a really interesting time. I got to travel to a lot of places. This picture in the bottom left is from a trip to Lithuania that I went to, where I was able to spend a month working with a collaborator there at Vilnius University in the capital of Lithuania. So that was really fascinating and a lot of fun. But as I said, I didn't really know what would be next. Perfectly honestly, I was feeling a little burned out as I was reaching the end of my graduate degree. And so I didn't really want to do a postdoc, which I felt would probably turn into a second postdoc before fighting for one of the few and rare tenure track positions. I was also in a two-body problem where my partner had a much better or much more defined career path for finishing his PhD. So it made sense to let him do his thing and I would tag along afterwards because I didn't have a good sense of what I wanted to do. Um, One other thing to note is that in grad school, I was terrified of public speaking. I would give talks at conferences and I could literally feel my knees shake. So in preparation for my PhD defense, I joined a group called Toastmasters, which really helps build up my confidence in public speaking, in developing speeches, which started me off on this career in science communication to some extent. I didn't know it would do that at the time. I just wanted to get through my defense without passing out and being able to sound like a reasonable person when people would ask me questions. So if you are like me, terrified of public speaking or were in the past, Toastmasters is a great way to practice that in a safe environment. And there are clubs all across the country, all across the world. So it's a really interesting organization to give you some exposure and practice. As I mentioned, I didn't know what I wanted to do next. My husband ended up finding a job in Washington, D.C. So after we finished our PhDs, I tagged along and didn't really have a sense of what I would be doing. I was fortunate in that my PhD advisor allowed me to continue doing some hourly work after I graduated so that I would have some level of income to finish up manuscripts and things like that from our work together while I looked for a job. And it took a little while, but along the way, I learned that skills from graduate school are highly transferable, and it is okay to do something entirely new to you. So I found a job actually in the Washington Post classified section where they were advertising for people who had quantitative skills. And as a physics PhD, I said, gosh darn it, I have quantitative skills. Um, so I applied and ended up getting a job as a um, consultant for capital project management. So basically, when large refineries or chemical companies were going to undertake some big project, replacing a tank, adding on a new piece of process, equipment, things like that, our company would come in and evaluate their preparedness to do so, as well as their effectiveness at the end of the project. We would build custom models for how long things should take and how much money things should cost. So we were able to take these statistical models and compare their projects and their level of preparedness against industry standards, which was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. Over 3 years, I was able to visit refineries, paper plants, chemical companies, and really get to see how industry worked. It was a good time, but after a few years, I found myself doing the same type of thing every month. One capital project is much like another, which is how we could build models and things like that. So I was starting to miss the science of what I did. Um, And, I didn't necessarily want to go back to the bench, but I wanted something more science adjacent in my life. Um, I will say that here I was able to again build on my communication skills. Since we did have these complex statistical models, I was forced to be able to break those down and explain these technical factors that went into our evaluations to business leaders. So it was an entirely new audience from what I'd been used to in academia, but I was able to create that translation of the complex technical aspects that I was getting from the project teams and from our evaluations, and to deliver that to business leaders through presentations. So that communication skill was starting to grow and starting to be developed by being able to talk to new audiences here. Um, but as I mentioned, I was getting a little tired a few years in of doing the same type of evaluation, and I was looking for something a little bit more science adjacent. So I decided to shift course. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, but I had heard it was a great way to get into the world of government science. So I decided to throw my hat in the ring and apply for this. I was very fortunate to land an executive branch fellowship with NASA in the Earth Science Division. Uh, this was a really good time. And I have to say, even interviewing in the finalist week was so much fun. I got to interview 14 different government offices. And frankly, I didn't know we had that many government offices who had to do with science. Of course, you think about it, um, or you would realize that if you thought about it too much, but you don't always see the effects of government science on a day-to-day basis if you're not actively involved. So I was really excited. I got to learn a lot about what our government did. And I got to meet and talk with so many cool people. Honestly, the imposter syndrome among the other group of finalists was real. Um, but somehow I managed to find my way into NASA, and I was again very excited to be there. I got to do a number of things and travel to a lot of places. In the upper left, I saw a failed rocket launch of the resupply mission to the ISS, which was certainly not how I'd expected that trip to go. I was very thrilled to see my first rocket launch, and unfortunately, it did not end well. I think we were some of the closest humans. My sister had gotten to go to a tweet up from NASA Social, and since I was a NASA employee, I could tag along. Um, and that was not what we expected. Uh, I've got to go to a number of conferences. I met R2D2 at a conference of the American Geophysical Union, which was a lot of fun. And you can see our class in the bottom right. One thing that the fellowship really brought home is that it's important to talk to people. So they introduced the concept of informational interviews, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, but it's basically trying to just talk to people and find out how they ended up in their current position, find out what skills are important, how they got there, um, what types of opportunities are there, what types of skills are useful in that type of position. And generally, people are more than happy to talk to you about themselves. Um, it's a little scary and intimidating to send a cold email asking for a fragment of somebody's time, but most people are surprisingly ready and available to talk. Um, so it's a very important concept that I learned in the fellowship, and one that I will encourage all of you to pursue as well, the concept of the informational interview. So if you aren't familiar with the SCPF fellowship, the goal is to foster scientifically informed evidence-based policy and practice. It really is designed to bring in people who are past their PhD, or their terminal degree, master's in engineering, and bring those skills into the federal government. And we talk about having two different types of science policy. There is policy for science, which often results in funding levels and setting national priorities and that type of science policy. And then there is science for policy, which is where you need the science to inform the policies that you're creating it. And whether that's vaccination priorities, as the CDC is undertaking now, or whether that is a national climate change strategy, those sorts of things all rely on underlying government science and non-government science as well. Um, they have placements available in the executive branch and the congressional branch. So AAAS sponsors 2 congressional fellows, and many other scientific societies also sponsor congressional fellows. So if you're interested in working in Congress and bringing your scientific expertise directly to a legislator or a congressional committee, check out your other professional societies as well and see if they sponsor a fellow. Now, I was frankly surprised that I was able to get one of these fellowships. You know, I don't believe in myself as much as I perhaps should, which, you know, is a common problem in academia. Um, but one thing that I think was really important in my application was that I brought out my communication skills again. So I talked about being able to work in an interdisciplinary lab and being able to translate information from one discipline to another, translate information from a technical audience to a business person. Because again, in the government world, when you're talking with policymakers, that sort of skill is very important. Congressional legislators don't have the time to become deep experts in all of the scientific areas that affect their constituency. So they need somebody who can do that research, understand the lay of the land, and translate it to them in a prioritized manner that they can understand and that they can go on and share with others. So having somebody to serve as that scientific translator and scientific analysis is really important in our government. So if you're interested in policy, which has its own level of communication, I highly recommend this fellowship. It's a great opportunity for coming to Washington for a year or two and bringing those skills to government. As my fellowship was ending, I did end up renewing for a second year. Again, I started looking for what was next. And through NASA, in my fellowship, I was able to work with the US Global Change Research Office. US Global Change Research Program. And this is a multidisciplinary, multi-agency program that coordinates federal climate change research. Importantly, they also put out the National Climate Assessment every 4 years. So I was part of the team that developed the 4th National Climate Assessment, which came out in 2018. This was a tremendous opportunity. I felt like the work I was doing mattered, and in some ways I was atoning for having consulted with oil and gas clients in my previous positions. So it was a great way to take my scientific background, you know, even though my work as a physicist had very little to do with the work I was doing in my fellowship or beyond, having the skills that I learned in my PhD were able to translate into effective skills in communication and research for my fellowship and for working on the National Climate Assessment. So this position again came rather naturally out of my fellowship, since I was working with the people already, and a position came available at the right time as I was finishing up. So it was a pretty natural transition, which was great. But it's important to realize along the way that networks matter. Um, Again, I wouldn't have known about this office or this fellowship or this opportunity if it weren't for my fellowship and the work that I were doing there. Um, Similarly, as I'll talk about the next transition, the people I met at USGCRP, the Global Change Research Program, also directly led to my next position. And having these networks of people are important. And I know it's very frustrating to hear that networking is everything, but the concept of the coffee date is important in DC. Maybe more so than in other areas. I'm not sure. But again, that informational interview is really important to helping you build these networks. And again, you don't need to go to an informational interview to get a job from them, but just to learn from them and bring them into your network. And if you talk to them about what you're interested in doing and how they got to where they are, they're more likely to think of you when something does come up as well. So after we released the fourth National Climate Assessment, again, I was feeling the need to try something new. I didn't necessarily want to work directly on the fifth National Climate Assessment since I had just done the fourth one. So I was looking for a new position, and somebody I'd worked with at USGCRP had moved over to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in the Center for Public Engagement as their program director. As I was starting my career search, she had shared that a new position on her team was open to run the Mass Media Fellowship. And since I had had such a tremendous experience with the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, this seemed like an interesting way to come full circle almost and join the fellowship community from a different side. I recognized how valuable the STPF network was for me, and so I wanted to be able to bring that same value and network to alumni of the Mass Media Fellow program as well. Now, if you're not familiar with AAAS, we publish the magazine Science, but we really have a much broader mission than that. In general, our mission is to advance science for the benefit of all people, which is surprisingly broad, but it means we do a lot of things. We've been around for a long time. We're a member-driven organization, have over 120,000 members, and we really do work in many different areas to try to advance science for the benefit of all people. Now, I mentioned specifically that I work in the Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology, and here we have a vision that science and society are in dialogue with one another and draw upon relevant expertise. So we want to start moving away from this one-way direction of science communication, or what we think of as science communication. When we're in academia, we often think about it information dumps and a one-way deficit model of communication, where people just don't know the information that I have, so I will share this information with them, and then they will change their mind, or they will take up the view or the position that I want them to. And in reality, it doesn't quite work that simply. So we really focus on this two-way dialogue and actual engagement with an audience rather than a one-way communication dump. Our center does a lot of different programs. Importantly, we provide communicating science workshops that organizations can bring us in to lead 3-hour workshops on how to communicate better. We also have specialized modules for communicating with policymakers, the media. We have a new climate module. We have a module on communicating with faith communities. So there are all sorts of ways we can tailor our message to understand what our clients are looking for in our communicating science offerings. Um, One of the things that I do here at the Center for Public Engagement is help run something called the AAAS If-Then Ambassadors. This is part of a broader If-Then mission, which is an initiative of Lyda Hill Philanthropies. The goal is really to provide high-profile role models of women in STEM for middle school girls, with the theory of if she can see it, then she can be it. So they had worked with the Gina Davis Institute to understand the representation of women in STEM in the media and found it sorely lacking, but that those few role models of women in STEM who had existed were influential, such as Scully on The X-Files. And so they partnered with us to select 125 amazing women in STEM. They all gathered here in Dallas in this photo back in October. I know it might be a little jarring to see so many people close together without a mask these days, but this was pre-COVID. And we were able to bring them all together for some communication training to take high quality photos and videos of them to enable better representation of women in the media, and to provide those resources to schools and museums and nonprofits who are interested in portraying scientists other than your standard old white male that is too common in representations of science in the media. So that's about half of my job. And the other half of my job, as I mentioned, is running this AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. Um, the goal of this fellowship is to strengthen connections between scientists and journalists and really enhance science journalism across the country. So our program takes science grad students and postdocs and puts them in a newsroom for 10 weeks over the summer to be a science journalist. You're treated as a staff reporter and you are off and running, writing about the latest science for your audience, whether that's for an audience in Wichita at the Wichita Eagle, I believe, or whether that's for a national audience through some place like Science Friday. We have fellows at media outlets all across the country in all sorts of different media markets. We're trying to move a little bit more into alternate markets, so a little bit more into the podcast and YouTube science communication world to see what is going on there as well. But typically we have fellows at newspapers across the country and magazines like Discover or Scientific American. So it's a really great way for scientists, science grad students, science postdocs to practice their journalism skills and practice their science writing. Sometimes they go on to become science writers or science journalists, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just take those skills back to academia. And from my perspective as a fellowship director, I win either way. If my goal is really to make science journalism better, having media trained scientists is a fantastic way to do that. And having science trained journalists is another great way to do that. So bringing this connection between scientists and newsrooms really helps serve the goal of enhancing science journalism either way. And so I'm going to stop here and talk a little bit about life outside of academia, and then we'll go into a little bit of science communication tips. So from my experience, I would encourage you to think about what you like doing. What is it about your career that you enjoy? Do you like communicating? Do you like doing outreach? Do you like being in the lab? Do you like figuring out new things? Do you like reading and doing literature searches? All of these different things that you enjoy about being a grad student or a postdoc can help guide you in your next career. I'd also encourage you to try different things. There is no one right career path, and this goes along with the next one too. You can do one thing and then try something else if it's not exactly what you want. One of the best pieces of advice I got at an SCPF career workshop was that you're all very smart people and you could do any number of things. So just pick what seems interesting to you at the time. It doesn't all have to be this one planned out glorious career trajectory from the beginning. But you can develop this career trajectory, this unique career trajectory for you by taking whatever seems most interesting at the time. And that's perfectly okay. We're all searching for what makes us happy and what we enjoy doing. And sometimes that takes some trial and error, and that's okay. And then my last piece of major advice there is to talk to people. Don't be afraid to reach out to somebody you follow on Twitter and say, hey, I think what you're doing is amazing. Can we chat for 15 minutes about how you're doing this or how it worked? And more often than not, people are willing to chat. All right, I will pause there if we have any questions that have come in about my trajectory before getting into a little bit more about science communication.
One of them is, what do you think about doing a postdoc in the industry? I don't know if you have any experience or any opinions on that, but.
So as I mentioned, I haven't done a postdoc in industry. The industry that I went to was definitely not on the same research and development side, such that it had things like postdocs. I do think that working in industry provides a different perspective on the type of work that you're doing. So that can be a really valuable thing to see what it's like somewhere outside of academia. While academia is great. Most of the people that you're working with have only ever known academia, so they can't necessarily guide you to career paths outside of what they've been doing, whether that's the, basically the grad student, postdoc, professor route. And so there are so many more options outside of that that I think gaining some of that outside perspective could be particularly helpful.
Um, Also, we have a question regarding the age and experiencing these different trajectories. Someone kind of want to know, when is it too late to just change paths like that?
It's never too late. Seriously though, we in the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, for instance, they have fellows from all types of their career stages. So some people come in straight from their PhD and apply as soon as they've got that degree behind their name. Others treat it as a sabbatical from a professorship career opportunity. And some come to it as they are approaching retirement and have had a full career in academia and are deciding that, you know what, I should do something else for the last bits of my career and try to make a difference in government. Um, so really, the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, for instance, is really quite broad in its fellowship stage. I think there's a lot of value to people with experience coming into the fellowship. For the mass media fellowship that I talked about, we only go through postdocs and sort of a year out from a postdoc. So we're really focused on those early career people who are going to go on to have a career after this fellowship.
Great. So if someone is still in grad school or during their postdocs, are there any activities, let's say, or even courses if they're still in school, that they can take, or things, that they can get involved with, that would help them getting a position or preparing for a science communication job?
Sure, I would say that there definitely are. Um, And I will also say that I didn't take advantage of them. So it is not a requirement by any means.
Mhm.
Particularly at the University of Michigan, there was an entire career in science, or a certificate program, basically a minor, as in grad school, of science policy. And I never felt like I had the time or ability to take a class outside of my direct lab responsibilities. So I never took it.
Mhm.
And it is a well-regarded program. And, in retrospect, I should have said, nope, this semester is my time. I'm going to take a class that can be really interesting and teach me about life outside of academia. Um, so there, again, depending on where you are, I don't know what FAU offers. Perhaps one of you might know a little bit better. Um, but definitely try taking classes outside of the lab if you can.
Maybe
Um,
the outreach programs.
Maybe outreach programs. I had a fellow grad student of mine who ended up taking a business class while we were in grad school together because she was interested in entrepreneurship and wanted to figure out how that all works. So it can definitely be done, and it can help build those skills for whatever you want to come next. And as I mentioned, joining that Toastmasters group really helped me with my public speaking. And it's not a formal class, but it was a helpful tool in my belt to build some of these skills.
Absolutely. All right, I'm gonna let you go on, and I'll go
All
back to
right,
the questions at the end.
perfect. So I just wanted to give you guys a few tools for science communication. Um, as I mentioned, we give these science communication workshops. So I'm just going to give you a few sneak peek things from this workshop. And in particular, it's important to remember that when you're communicating in academia, you have a very different audience and a very different style of communication than when you're speaking to a public or an audience outside of academia. Our typical academic papers start with the background of the research question, go into supporting details and methodology and extreme detail about the layouts of how things worked and the methods, and it's not till the end of the paper that you get the results and more importantly, the discussion and the conclusion about what you found and why it's important. On the contrary, when you're talking to the public, you really need to put that bottom line first. You only have so much time to get a reader's attention, to catch the attention of somebody you're speaking to. And so you really need to say, we found X as your first sentence or your first few sentences when you're speaking to the public. Once you have that, this is what we found headline, you get into the so what? Why does it matter to you? Then you can provide a little bit more of that context and really make that connection between what you found and the audience that you're speaking with or communicating with. Then, once you have them hooked with that bottom line, they know what you did and why they should care, then you can get into some of the supporting details. And you're not going to go into as much detail as you would in an academic paper, but then you can get into those nitty gritty things like, this is what we did, and this is how it varied from previous attempts to measure this or from previous attempts to look at that as well. So really, when you're thinking about communicating outside of the lab, outside of academia, flip your usual research communication style on its head and focus on that bottom line, that so what right up front. That's really critical. And there are a number of different careers that you can have in communication. These are just a few of the things. There's public engagement and outreach, as Lorena mentioned. There are often opportunities to get involved with outreach. A lot of our If Then ambassadors are particularly good at public engagement and outreach, which is why they're ambassadors. Whether that is communicating with classrooms about the work that they do, whether that is participating in science festivals, working with a local museum to host an event, even working with your lab or an outreach office within your university to organize events and get involved that way. Could be judging science fairs, things like that. There's a lot of ways to do public engagement and outreach, and you can actually make a career out of this as well. There are museums who have interpretive officers who help build museums and museum exhibits. More and more universities have outreach opportunities and outreach offices where you can get involved to do outreach within the community connected to a university. In communication, we often have press or public information officers as well, and these are people who are typically associated with a university or perhaps a company who is involved in promoting the work that is done within that university or company. And so these are the people who write press releases when cool new research comes out of your university. They have good relationships with journalists and are able to write good stories about all of the work that goes into all of the good research that comes out of the university. So these are a way to bridge that communication academic barrier as well and fill that gap in between. Science writers and science communicators can also get the job of science editors. So sometimes you can be much better at editing something than you are at writing something it's yourself. I tend to prefer editing than writing. There's a love-hate relationship there. But if you give me something that is written already, I can edit the heck out of it. So it's a lot of fun to do science editing, and a career in science communication and science journalism can lead into science editing as well. And lastly, there's the career that I am most familiar with in my position as the mass media director. You can be a science writer or journalist. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means of careers you can have in communication. Maybe you want to be the next David Attenborough or the next Bill Nye. And those are opportunities as well, though they're a little more nebulous to me as how you get there. So as I mentioned again, the Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellowship is a good way to get into some of these communications. We have fellows who go on to do all 4 of those different categories of communication career. The applications are currently open through January 1st, and as postdocs, you would be eligible. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in doing, it is a paid opportunity. There's a $7,000 stipend for a 10-week fellowship or internship effectively over the summer, and we have placements in both English and Spanish outlets. So if you prefer to do your Spanish or your science communication in Spanish, we also have opportunities to do that as well. If you have any questions about the fellowship, please do email me. I can share my email address in the chat, but it is, I'm happy to talk more about the fellowship in any ways. And then lastly, there are a number of resources that are available to you as well. AAAS and our Center for Public Engagement has a communication toolkit, which can provide you with some of the information, like that concept of flipping the triangles of communication, that's available on our website. There are also a number of groups and organizations that you can join. In particular, I'm a fan of the group called NPR SciCommers. They have an active Slack channel where you can get together with other like-minded individuals and practice your science writing. They have an office hours program where you can work with them to develop a pitch to get something published. And they also have peer feedback and regular mentor chats once a month to learn a little bit more about science communication as well. And more, there are organizations and conferences like Science Talk or ComSciCon that are focusing on science communication as well. I also suggest just starting writing and pitching. There's an organization called The Conversation, if you're not familiar with it, which is particularly good at bringing in writers from academia to write journalistic pieces for others. So if you're interested in starting this, The Conversation is a really good entry point into communication and into writing. And then also I want to suggest that you learn from those who came before. So there are a number of books and resources online where you can learn. I'm a particular fan of a website called The Open Notebook. They have interviews with journalists. They have how to pitch information if you're interested in actually publishing a story somewhere. They have a whole Science Journalism 101 section of articles, but they're all about the craft of science writing, and they write articles about how to write science. So it's a great opportunity for that. They also have a book called The Craft of Science Writing, and there's also the Science Writer's Handbook, which has a lot of useful information about science journalism and starting a career in science journalism as well. So with that, I think I will stop and open up for the rest of the questions.
All right. So one of the questions, and it's kind of going back to almost the beginning of your talk when you talked a little bit about policy. What is the best way to look for government and policy jobs? Do you
That's
have
a good
any
question.
advices on that?
Sure. So the fellowship is a great way into government and policy positions, but it is certainly not the only way into positions. I would suggest looking into USA Jobs for all of your official government positions. But even more so, the government is filled with contractors, and the policy arena has nonprofits and NGOs who are working in the policy sphere as well. So if there's a particular policy issue that you're interested in, I suggest looking at the various nonprofits and organizations working in that sphere as a way to start bridging that science communication or that science policy world as well. Yeah, there are so many opportunities that it's hard to know where to direct you exactly. But again, this is where that concept of an informational interview comes in handy too. If you find somebody who has your dream job, send them an email and find out how they got there. And again, they may or may not answer, but more often than not, they're flattered and are thrilled that somebody found out who they were and is interested in what they have to say.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, and then there's another question that also could be a bit general, and you may not have like one straight answer to it, but the other thing that people are interested in is how is the compensation for these kind of jobs, and like how do they compare to jobs in academia, for example?
I think it depends on what you're interested in. You know, some PhD fields are more lucrative than others. I imagine if you're working on vaccines, for instance, you might be in high demand right about now. And, you know, but for those of us who aren't in the biomedical world, I would say things like the policy fellowship is a good salary for a PhD level person, likely comparative to assistant professor level salaries. Um, Working for nonprofits in policy or communication does tend to take not a pay cut, but does tend to have lower pay than some other positions. But nonprofits also have generally pretty good benefits. So it's always worth looking at the total compensation package when you're looking for a new position. There are other ways you can be compensated, whether that's vacation time or benefits, IRA matching. Flexibility, I would say working from home is something you can negotiate for, but that's probably something that we're all going to be dealing with for a while still. But that goes to another point, is that you should always negotiate. And it's a scary thing to do. But once they've extended you an offer, they're invested in having you take that position. And so it's a matter of trying to find where you can both be happy and livable with the package that they're offering. And you should always negotiate, even if it doesn't feel like something's negotiable. Send an email and find out, or pick up the phone and give them a call and say, hey, is there any flexibility here? I'm really excited to work with you, but I just can't make this work. So
Awesome.
always negotiate.
Awesome. Do you think that your life is less stressful than it would have been if you had stayed in academia and went through a tenure track position?
I think that probably depends on when and where in your career you are. Certainly, I feel like I don't have the stress of a tenure clock hanging over my head, which I appreciate. And I also think in my particular field, and probably in most of yours, the stress of trying to do the fundraising and get these extra super competitive grants is something that I wasn't particularly thrilled about. I preferred doing the research to writing the grant and asking the government for money. So I like it better. That said, what works for me does not necessarily work for everybody. And what brings each of us stress is probably a little different. Certainly when we have some busy days when all of our applications close and I need to review a couple hundred applications for a fellowship, that is a stressful time, but it works.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay, just while we allow for people to ask their last questions, we still have time for a few more. So, guys, if you want to ask anything, now's the time. But one of our attendees asked, maybe if you could go back to the slide where you have some information on that 10-week fellowship. There's some questions about the name and how to apply and everything. So, yeah, yep. Perfect. Thank you.
So if you go to AAAS.org/MMF, you will also get to this information.
Awesome. Let's see. What other questions do we have here? Okay, well, that was you.
Yep, just putting my email address in the chat.
Yeah.
So if you have any specific questions.
So some are asking like how competitive it is recently to get that fellowship.
It is a competitive fellowship, and people do often apply more than once. But that said, like any fellowship or any job application, it's always going to be a little fickle. I know when I was job hunting, I sent in my resume to a few places where I was clearly the perfect candidate for the job, but I never got a call back. And that happens. So similarly, when you're applying to fellowships, don't take no as an actual signal of your strength. Sometimes things just don't work out the right way. And sometimes they do. So you should always try.
Yeah, thanks. Since you mentioned the negotiation, and I think we've heard this a couple of times also when we had speakers coming from the industry, for example, also suggesting the negotiation. And a lot of people are actually kind of cautious about that, like almost afraid to negotiate, right? Like how far can I go? Or like if I negotiate, does that, means that I'm risking losing that offer or something like that? So do you have any advices
Sure.
for whoever is in that position that they're just like unsure about the negotiation part of it?
Sure. So I will say you're almost never risking losing the offer as a result of asking for something else. You may not get it, but you're almost never going to have them withdraw the offer simply because you negotiated. And I will say that in the very rare case that that happens, you probably don't want to work for them anyway. It's not a sign of a very healthy organization, it seems. So always negotiate. And I know I was hesitant, and I have not done a terrific job of negotiating in some of my past positions because I was just thrilled to have a job, any job. So it's hard for me to say that, you can be strong and do it, but you can. I was lucky enough to have a mentor at my previous position who was able to convince me to ask for more vacation time, for instance. And, I had seen the list in the benefits package and just assumed that that's what it was and it was not negotiable. But you know what? It's negotiable. Um, and so had somebody not told me that, I would never have even tried. There are things that you can surprise yourself doing. I know when I was writing the email to ask for a different number and a different package, I spent a long time on that email, and I wordsmithed, and I had other people look at it because I was afraid of sounding too needy or too whatever. But I still sent it in the end, and it was useful. One person suggested this tip, particularly when you're moving into industry, for how to find a number. And I haven't exactly taken this, but stand in the mirror and start saying salary numbers and keep going up. When you get to a point where you laugh, that's the number you should ask for. I haven't tried this particular technique myself, but she did, and she was surprised at how far it got her in some cases.
Nice. Awesome. All right. So since we're running out of time, if you have anything else that you would like to say to finish, otherwise I'll give my thank you. And
I just want to say thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk. I'm always happy to chat science communication or journalism or science policy. So feel free to send me an email if you have any other questions or would like to chat. Thank you for having me.
awesome. No, thank you. This was fantastic. Very fun talk, very informative, and yeah, just fantastic talk. Really appreciate you agreeing to speak to us and give us all this information, and also providing your email and all of that. I'm sure that a lot of us will be able to benefit from that and all of the tips and fellowship and all those things that you brought to us. So thank you very much, Kristin, again. Thank you all that joined us. Stay safe, and happy holidays, because I won't see you again until next year.
Happy holidays,
All right.
everybody.
Bye-bye.